Hi, and welcome to Data Visualization in the Social Sciences. This video just gives you a short review of how to recognize when two variables are related. So remember that in social science data, we're always trying to ask questions about the potential relationships between two variables. A variable is just a thing that we're measuring. It's something that can have different values or levels across different people in our data. And when we try to recognize relationships between them, we use different phrases that you'll see come up over and over again throughout the course. If two variables are related, like imagine one variable would be education and another variable would be how much money somebody makes in their job after they finish their education. Education is one variable, how much money they make is another, and they're related. More education often means that people make more money and do higher skill jobs after that. So education and the amount of money that people make are related. If we say that two variables are related, other ways of phrasing that might be that the two variables are dependent on each other. So how much money somebody makes might be dependent on how much education they have. If two variables were not related, let's say that for some reason how much money somebody makes was not related to how much education they have, we would say that they are independent of each other. Other phrases we might use would be that we can predict one if we know the other when two variables are related. So if we know that somebody has a college education versus a high school education, we can predict that their income might be higher with the college degree than with the high school degree. If two variables were not related, so if the amount of money that somebody made was not related to their education, then knowing one wouldn't really tell us much about the other. So if there was no relationship between somebody's education and their income, then knowing what their education is doesn't give us information about what their income might be. So try to keep in mind that these are the kinds of phrases that will be corresponding to each other throughout the rest of the course. Related, dependent on each other, we can predict one if we know the other. So let's walk through a quick example for recognizing when two variables might be related. So let's take a look at the relationship between the kind of job that people have and their level of job satisfaction. So we would have two variables here. One would be the kind of job that somebody does. The other would be how much they're satisfied with that job. And the example that we'll use draws on data from the General Social Survey. The General Social Survey is what we call a random sample of the US population. So a bunch of researchers at the General Social Survey's Research Institute try to contact randomly selected adults throughout the United States every couple of years, and then they ask them a large number of survey questions that measure their characteristics, their attitudes about things, what kinds of job they do, whether they're satisfied with that job. And it's important that these adults are randomly selected because that means that this sample is going to represent the US population. So if we only collected data from people that happened to be nearby, we don't necessarily know what makes somebody more likely to be nearby versus less likely to be nearby. But if we pick them completely at random, then we have a better sense that this sample of people, this slice of the population, somehow represents that larger population of people that we want to know something about. So that's why it's really important that this is a random sample. It tells us something about the larger population. It gives us like a miniature picture of the whole thing. And in the General Social Survey, the first variable that we'll look at is the occupation, the title of job that a person has. And we'll look at just 5 different levels of that variable for occupation, 5 specific different kinds of jobs. The other variable is their job satisfaction. So they ask the person whether they're very satisfied, moderately satisfied, or dissatisfied with the job that they currently have. Both of these survey questions ask people to respond with words in terms of what their occupation is, what their job satisfaction is. And when they're giving these worded responses, that means we have categorical variables. So what we're looking at is the relationship between two categorical variables. In terms of thinking about which one's the predictor and which one's the outcome, we can think about what the order is that kind of determines what the relationship might look like. So somebody's job satisfaction, how they feel about a job, comes after they get that job. So if occupation has to come first, then the occupation would be the predictor variable, and the job satisfaction would be the outcome variable. So how do we tell if these two are related to one another? Let's look at a summary of the data from the General Social Survey first. And the way that we can summarize the potential relationship between two categorical variables is with a contingency table. This is something that we talked about in lecture already. A contingency table is the kind of table that shows you the counts of individual people across the different combinations of values for the two categorical variables. So what we've got here is a contingency table where the rows have the levels of the variable occupation and the columns have the levels of the variable job satisfaction. So this is a table that we would say is 5 by 3. That little x, we pronounce it by. It's 5 by 3 because there are 5 levels of the variable occupation, and there are 3 levels of the variable job satisfaction. So there are only 2 variables here, but one has 5 levels and one has 3 levels. So 5 by 3 refers to how many levels the first variable has by how many levels the second variable has. And if we're just looking at the table, that number 25 in the upper left column and row, that's telling us that there were 25 people in the survey who were financial managers, and they said that they were very satisfied with their jobs. So to understand if there's a relationship between job satisfaction and the kind of job that somebody does, we can see if these frequencies or these counts of people in the different portions of the table, we call each little individual box a cell. We can see if the distribution of these counts across the cells is different for some occupations relative to others. But the first thing that we need to do is figure out how to measure the amount of job satisfaction in each occupation when we have different numbers of people in each occupation. So there are more people that are registered nurses in the survey than there are people who are physicians. So we need to adjust for the fact that there are different total numbers of people in the occupations. We can do that pretty easily in Excel by first adding a new column at the very end of our table that gives us the total number of people in each of the occupations. So what we would do is type total at the top of that new column, and we would use the function sum, which sums or adds together the numbers of people across all of the different satisfaction levels for financial managers, and then for lawyers, then for physicians, registered nurses, social workers, etc. In Excel, we'll use that sum function, and we'll type in sum, and in parentheses, we'll highlight all 3 of the columns that come before the total column. And then when we hit enter, we can grab the small green box in the lower right corner of that cell and fill all the way down that column. That gives us the total number of people in every occupation. Then we can use that total column to calculate the percent of people that are very satisfied in each of the individual occupations. All we have to do there is at the top of a new column, type percent very satisfied as the title for that new column, and then we'll use the formula equals the number that are very satisfied, which is column B, divided by the total number of people in the occupation, which is column E. So the percent of financial managers that are very satisfied with their jobs would be 25 divided by 43. And then we hit enter, click the little green box at the bottom right of that cell, fill all the way down that column, and that tells us for every one of those 5 occupations, what's the percent of people in the survey who say that they're very satisfied with their job. And then we can highlight that column and click the percent hot button up at the top of the Excel window, and that will turn our proportions with the decimal places into the percents. The final thing that we can do is visualize it. And the Excel file for this little review is on Canvas, so you can go through the Excel file and see how I calculated these columns and how I created that chart for yourself. And we'll visualize it using this column chart. And the column chart has the occupations, which are our predictor variable. It has all of the levels of that occupation on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis. The y-axis shows us the percent in each one of those occupations who say that they're very satisfied with their job. And the height of the column is what tells us the level of job satisfaction within each occupation, or the percent that are very satisfied. And what we see is that the columns have different heights. So the column is the tallest for physicians and registered nurses. It's the smallest for social workers. So the percent that are very satisfied with their job is different between the occupations. If we see a difference between the occupations, that means that occupation and job satisfaction are related. So different patterns across the different occupations means there's a relationship. If we know somebody's occupation, we can make a prediction about what their job satisfaction might be. So if we know that somebody is a physician or a registered nurse, we can predict that they'll have high job satisfaction. But if they're a social worker, we can predict that their job satisfaction might be lower. So that's how we recognize when two variables are related. We see a different pattern of the outcome across the levels of the predictor. If all of these columns were the exact same height, that would tell us that there's not a relationship. So if we knew somebody's occupation, we couldn't make a prediction if their job satisfaction would be higher or lower for social workers relative to physicians, because the heights of those columns would all be the same. So if we see the same pattern across all of the variables, or across all of the levels, then we would say that the variables are not related or that they're independent. But when they're different, like we see in this chart, it tells us that the variables are related, because knowing what job somebody's in lets us predict their level of job satisfaction. In this week's Try It exercise, you'll keep building on this skill and working with data in Excel to try to recognize the relationships between multiple predictor variables and an outcome. So you'll work with data in both the Try It and the lab quiz data that instead of it's just being one predictor, there are now two predictor variables. So how can you look at the potential relationship between each predictor and the outcome? And do the relationships between each of those two predictors and the outcomes depend on each other? And so we're just building up to expand our ability to look at multiple relationships between variables in our data.